Hello, everyone. I'm so happy to be here for the second annual LGBTQ plus Elder Housing Services Symposium. In this initial roundtable discussion, we turn towards the individuals, the activists, and the organizations on the ground directly in service to rural LGBTQ plus elders. We aim to learn the significant barriers they may experience and how their resilience has fostered creative solutions. But further, we hope to inform our day 2 roundtable discussion, recognizing that we really must turn to the people to define community for themselves. And so without further ado, I'm going to introduce our panelists. We have 3 incredible individuals here today. And first off, we have Trudy Jackson, an enrolled member of the Navajo Nation, identifies as a two-spirit transgender relative. She is one of the Bitterwater and Folded Arms people. Her maternal grandfather is of the Mexican people, and her paternal grandfather is Yucca Strung Out in the Line people. Originally from Ticnos, Arizona, she advocates on behalf of two-spirit and transgender women in the Southwest region, including sovereign nations. Her advocacy has led to spearheading the Southwest American Indian Rainbow Gathering, which was a vision that continues to address health disparities within American Indian 2S LGBTQIA communities. In 2004, she founded the Miss Arizona Transgender Arizona pageant, which solely highlights language, cultural, and traditional values. She currently sits on the Phoenix Pride Education and Outreach Committee, advocating for people of color, inclusion of underrepresented communities, and diversity of underserved populations. Her dream is to open a nonprofit organization that caters specifically to two-spirit transgender relatives and building collaborative partners with sovereign nations that addresses policy changes. Welcome to the stage, Trudy. We're so happy to have you.
Thank you very much, Over, for the introduction, and just listening to the introduction just brought tears, basically. But I also look at the work that has been done and the work that continues that needs to be done, and especially working with tribal sovereign nations is something that I really advocate for. And hopefully in my lifetime, seeing more policies that reflect inclusion and diversity that is represented in urban spaces. So thank you, everyone, and I look forward to being on the panel.
Amazing. Thank you so much for that, Trudy. So looking forward to this conversation as well. Next, we have Gary Newman, who has over 35 years experience in the field of prevention and human resource development. He has worked successfully with a variety of tribal, state, and federal agencies in the area of program design, implementation, and evaluation, focusing on at-risk youth, their families, and communities. Currently, he works for a tribal tech as a TTA coordinator and serves as a task lead for training SAMHSA staff. He has developed a series of newsletters, Spirit, Honor, Inclusion being one of them, with a focus on two-spirit issues. Mr. Newman previously served as the project manager of the Rocky Mountain Tribal Access to Recovery 3 program. He also served as the Training and Technical Assistance Director of the Native American Center for Excellence, NACE, a national resource center for Native American substance abuse prevention, providing culturally centered training, technical assistance, and information resource services to a variety of Native and non-Native audiences throughout the United States. His work experience includes extensive knowledge of the Affordable Care Act, Tribal Law and Order Act, and how it applies to American Indians and Alaska Natives, having developed and conducted ACA trainings for Montana, Wyoming tribes, and Mr. Newman is skilled in assessment, capacity building, prevention specialist certification, marketing, grant writing, methamphetamine prevention, youth violence, bullying and suicide prevention, opioid addiction, and sustainability. Mr. Newman has developed several culturally appropriate training curricula, community-based organizing modules, and presented and trained at many national and international conferences throughout the United States, Alaska, and Canada. He is certified as an SAPST trainer and facilitator and certified prevention specialist. I'm curious to hear what those acronyms are. Mr. Newman is an enrolled member of the Confederated Salish Kootenai tribes of the Flathead Indian Nation and identifies as Two-Spirit. Happy to have you, Gary. Welcome to the stage.
Thank you so much. That was exhausting to listen to. And saying all that, the most important that isn't on there is that I am a father of 2, a grandfather of 7, and a great-grandfather of 5, soon to be 6. And my children and grandchildren and their children were all brought and celebrated as they came into this world without using substances. That's the most important thing.
That's incredible. Thank you so much. Welcome to the stage. Last but certainly not least, I have Quentin Q. Bell, who is a 30-year-old Black trans activist, entrepreneur, and mentor born and raised in historic Selma, Alabama. Q received his bachelor's degree from Alabama State University in business administration and graduated from the Allen Entrepreneurial Institute in 2015. While at ASU, Q co-founded the Knights and Orchids Society, Incorporated, a Southern-centered direct support nonprofit organization led by Black, queer, transgender, and gender nonconforming people fighting at the intersections of racial and gender justice. Since 2012, Quentin's goal remains unchanged to improve the quality of life within the LGBTQ plus community by creating safe spaces that empower, educate, and unite trans, gender nonconforming, and queer role models of color. Q has dedicated his adult life to actively serving in leadership positions to help advance the fight for LGBTQ plus equality and inclusion while increasing visibility for transgender men of color. He is a 2016 Transgender Justice Funding Project grantee, a 2017 Transgender Law Center National Training Institute for TGNC Leaders member, Gates Millennial Scholar alumni, and most recently, Quentin was a panelist for TJFP's first $1 million grant-making campaign. Welcome to the stage, Q, and I know that there's some amazing news that we're celebrating today if you want to share.
Yes, full circle moment. Thank you for having me in this space and being able to share space with y'all. But today, we're actually celebrating 10 years at TKL, the Knights and Orchids Society. So literally started this organization 10 years ago today.
That's incredible. Thank you so much, Q. So we're going to jump right in. I know we had some technical difficulties in the beginning, but we love a little bit of chaos. That's how we thrive. And so we're going to just jump into this conversation. If we have time for Q&A at the end, we'll keep that as is. But if not, we may have to move forward with the rest of our program. So I'm going to jump in. Trudy, I have the first question for you. Trudy, before we dive into your incredible resume of activism and professional, but also even more importantly, lived experience, I'd love to hear a little bit about your origin story and your journey to reclaiming your identity. And can you share that with us?
Hello, everyone. I'm Trudy, and I think growing up over on the Navajo Nation, I was not familiar with individuals who identified as such as myself. I always thought I was the only one over on the planet who lived and thought. But once I left the Navajo Nation, I didn't leave the reservation until I was a teenager. So getting exposed over to the urban setting, I was very confused over with all the acronyms that were thrown around, like the LGBTQ, but coming from Navajo, I always knew I was different, and to embrace the LGBT, I it took some time because I did not want to just identify over with an acronym, but I also wanted to remember first and foremost is I identify as a Navajo enrolled tribal member first. That's my first identity. And secondly is embracing the Western um, acronym. But I also think about my ancestors before colonization, individuals who were gender non-conforming, individuals who identified as two-spirit. So as I got older and more aware of who I was, that's when I embraced myself as a Diné, as Navajo, um, two-spirit transgender woman. And at times I would be asked, why do you include the Western terms? Having to live in the city, you have to balance both worlds. You have to identify as who you identify first with, and then embracing the second identity. So that's how I proudly identify now. I think it has taken me, I would say, in my lifetime, probably over close to 40 years to finally come to terms to identify as a trans woman of color. Thank you.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Trudy. And it's kind of remarkable how pervasive colonization is, where you're constantly, they're so married together. So being able to sift through that, but finding language and finding identity is so powerful. And it's sometimes all of a sudden when you're confronted with a way of being that you had never seen before, it's so powerful to finally kind of claim that as your own. So thank you for sharing that. Gary, I'm going to be turning to you for your first question. When we first met, we had a really incredible conversation. I really appreciated the learning about your work, but also the impact of your work. And it began with a personal story, a personal coming of age story. And so I would love to hear your story and your kind of origin story as well.
Well, thank you, Ephraim. And again, it's an honor to be on this panel with my esteemed colleagues. When I was born and raised on the Flathead Indian Reservation, when I became 5, our family was part of the Indian Relocation Act, where there weren't a lot of jobs on the reservation. So tribal families were relocated to urban settings where it was thought that they could get jobs or education and pretty much assimilate into the dominant society. So at 5, we moved from the reservation to an urban setting and really didn't learn a lot about being American Indian. And it wasn't until the summer, every year I would go back to my non-native grandparents. My older brother would go back to my native grandparents, and we would spend the summer with them. My grandparents, being non-native, took me to the powwow kind of as a looky-loo kind of a thing. Never was I taught how to make regalia or to dance or anything. And it was always from the outside. And it wasn't until 1979 when I moved to Alaska and worked with a bunch of individuals in that community that were at that time talking about being gay. It wasn't accepted where I was growing up. It wasn't accepted in the religious rigidity side of my family. And it wasn't until 1985 when my grandfather got sick on the reservation. And as with so many of us, when we're called, we go. I left Alaska, went back to Montana, and stayed with my grandfather until he passed. And I began a relationship with someone in Montana at that time. And I went to work for our tribe. And I remember being petrified at someone finding out that I might be gay. That was before the term two-spirit was even out there. And so I hid. I wasn't proud of who I was. We didn't share our relationship openly. And it wasn't until one day when I finally had a conversation with Clarence Woodcock, one of our cultural leaders. And I got up the courage and I said to him, well, I'm gay. And so that was his response. So, and I was just floored. And he said, well, Gary, did you know that the Salish and the Ponderay revered individuals that had the two-spirit quality. They could walk in both worlds. And he shared history of our tribe and of our people and the acceptance. And it absolutely overwhelmed me and opened my eyes to thinking about my non-native family my whole life, and that being unaccepted. And my native family, my aunties and my grandmother, never once shamed me, never once put me down for who I was. And it just made me realize that there was acceptance and there was honor. And it really changed my way of life.
That's so powerful, Gary, especially to kind of brace yourself for what you assumed was going to be a moment of pain, right? But then it's just kind of just evaporates with, and really, shouldn't that kind of always be the response that we get? So, you know, it's just this formality and this ritual of having to come out. It's just such a curious one, and I dream of a world where no one ever has to even do this in the first place. So, thank you so much, Gary. Quentin, coming for you. Your activism clearly fuels your work, and you have jokingly likened your work to liberate LGBTQ people in Selma to being the second leg of the civil rights movement, which to me, honestly, there's a lot of truth in that joke. And this was especially illustrated in a Washington Post article that I stumbled upon, where you raced to present before House Democrats to essentially beg them to see the inherent humanity in people just like you. So how does your relationship with Selma, the cradle of the civil rights movement, inform you and your team's passion?
That is an amazing question. How does my relationship with Selma inform my movement and my passion for the work? First off, I am a child of Selma. I'm a native of Selma. This is my hometown. Everything about this city I have learned to love because I've been able to experience so much here firsthand. Gosh, how does Selma inform my relationship? I fought tremendously hard to not return to Selma to do this work that I'm learning now, know that I am called to do. And being from Selma for me, it's not the civil rights monument that a lot of people see. It's the hometown, small, very small town that just happens to have a national reputation. The people that live here, the city at max holds about 65,000 people in our best years. And I've been here during the best times of Selma. I've seen the industry and the business grow. I've seen education. I've seen entrepreneurs thrive and make it. I think that was what was so great about the city. Selma is jokingly, or her nickname is the Queen City of the Black Belt. And to live here and be from here, it does feel like you're a royalty in that sense, that so much happened in a place that is so small that you can go anywhere in the U.S. and people know about Selma and the civil rights movement. And to be here, to be born here, is what actually drove me back home. I remember being homeless. I'm a first generation college kid. Parents, I lost my dad the first semester of my sophomore year in college. And my mom has always been on a fixed income. So I grew up very poor. And to be a first generation college kid, to be able to go to Montgomery on a full scholarship and experience Black queer people being free, full of joy, living authentically, it made me understand the responsibility of being visible. And when we think about visibility in this relationship to Selma and the civil rights movement, there are a lot of places that are monumental to the civil rights movement. But it was because foot soldiers, people who care more about the movement and the more about the progress that we can make collectively, they cared enough to put their lives on the line and march into danger on that bridge, on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. Me and my privilege, I have the luxury of waking up, going outside any day of the week, any time of the day, and standing at that bridge where my ancestors and so many of our ancestors shed blood and put their lives on the line so that I would have the opportunity to stand here before you. And then I think about that relationship and that commitment that dedication to a struggle. Somebody in that line of people who put their lives on the line, somebody believed with beyond the shadow of a doubt that we would have this opportunity that we're sharing now, that people could come together and rejoice and be free, and that we would have that opportunity because they were willing to make a commitment. So for me, when I started TKO, the Knights and Orchid Society, my number one goal was so that the next generation of trans kids, trans youth, trans elders wouldn't have to work as hard for the resources. They won't have to start from zero. My goal was to create a foundation that we can then pass on to the next generation to continue to build upon. And when I think about that, I could have been born anywhere in the world, any of these great places that we live in. And in this space, in this time, my soul was sent to Selma. And I can't, with all that I have learned, been able to leave Selma and have learned and soaked up and absorbed from being around elders, from being in different industries, it would have been selfish of me to not bring that back home. And for me, that relationship, it just shows up in everything we do, just like those soldiers who stood on that bridge on Bloody Sunday. The commitment that we make through TKO is far greater than ourselves. It's for the next generation of people.
I don't even know how to follow. I don't even know how to follow that. That was so beautiful. Thank you so much for that. And it just that the inheritance, but also the debt. When we look at our ancestors, the debt, the natural debt that exists there, but you're already the altruism that exists, that you're already looking forward to generations to come. So thank you so much for that answer. Trudy, we're going to come back to you. Much of your activism centers on the significant deficits in healthcare access to Native American, transgender, and Two-Spirit community members. In 2013, you co-authored a research article with Dr. Irene Vernon called Closing the Gap, a research agenda for the study of health needs among American Indian and Native Hawaiian transgender individuals. What stood out to me was your mention of non-existent elder transgender care, and you were clearly ahead of the curve of the mainstream conversation at the time. That was a decade ago. And so how do you assess the current landscape that exists of transgender healthcare, and how has that influenced your work today at the Mayo Clinic?
First of all, I just wanted to credit Dr. Irene Vernon over for the opportunity over to co-author this article. One thing I learned as an emerging trans scholar was not much scholar publications are out there written by Native trans scholars. And I felt that it was crucial for my voice over to be shared and incorporate my lived experiences of growing up on the Navajo Nation and working with tribes of the Southwest, where I would come across individuals who identify as trans and who live in the city, and where a lot of them would come to the city because the Indian Health Service in Phoenix is one of the primary healthcare facilities, and they provide hormones over for MTF as well as testosterone for FTM. So a lot of Native trans would come to the city. Even while things are progressing in the urban areas, things are so far back in tribal communities where a lot of hetero patriarchy leaders is you either identify as a male or a female. There's nothing in between. As a result of colonization, Christianity, genocide that were inflicted against my ancestors, especially individuals that identify as the third gender, the fourth gender, and the fifth gender, because within the Navajo, we identify over with five genders. And tribes are not equipped or knowledgeable or have staff members who identify from the community to lead such groups or organizations where policy changes you are where leaders are very hesitant over to policy changes, where assimilation has played so much, is that individuals' thoughts are just straight and male and female. So over to trans healthcare, the Indian Health Service has slowly started making progress, but not all tribal healthcare facilities reflect that. Um, Working in the urban spaces, a lot of trans individuals feel comfortable coming to clinics or non-native clinics over to get their care because they feel more comfortable instead of going to the Indian Health Service where they may have a relative or they may not understand. So I think so much work still has to be done, especially in tribal communities. And over to my knowledge, is I have not seen anything within tribal communities because I've done research regarding elder two-spirit housing in tribal communities. And one of the things that I always question over about tribes is when they receive federal grant fundings from HUD, and there are policies in place where it says you are not supposed to discriminate, but as sovereign nations, this is where sovereignty supersedes because we are our own sovereign nation. We call the shots. That's how tribes operate. So there has to be more work that has to be done over to address this, but also I think more of individuals who are very familiar over with policy changes, but also tribal leaders are not very um, informed and educated about trans people over in tribal communities. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Trudy. It's really remarkable to think, I know from your perspective, a lot of your work happens to be kind of equipping people with the tools and the knowledge to become educated, because then naturally that will hopefully transform the way that they actually engage with community. But it's not really about learning more so than unlearning and kind of returning back to a way of thinking that your ancestors held. And so it's just really remarkable. It just kind of a note again to the way colonization continues to just have that hold. And so, I just really appreciate that answer. Thank you so much, Trudy. Gary, I'm going to be turning back to you. You have been working with the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration as a technical assistant, supporting tribes where you are stationed in Anchorage, Alaska. Much of your work supports Native communities in developing and executing something that's called a tribal action plan. And that's to combat the prevalence of suicide and mitigate drug and alcohol misuse. And I would just love to hear, what was unique about the approach what is unique about the approach is in the recognition the plan centers each tribal's cultural understanding of health and wellness, fosters their strengths, and adapts to their unique and local needs. So can you tell us more about that process and your work?
I'll try. in echoing what Trudy said, in Anchorage and Fairbanks, they are the two urban if you will, areas where healthcare is provided to Alaska Natives. Alaska Natives in rural Alaska sometimes have to take 2 or 3 airplanes even to get to Fairbanks. And they can be weathered in, they can be stuck in another community until a plane is able to get out. They can't just get on the bus and go to a healthcare facility. And what we have learned is we're hearing that 1,920 LGBTQ youth attempt suicide every day. And Alaska, because of its remoteness and its ruralness, the villages, many of them are still very much tied to the religion that was kind of forced upon the villages years ago. And in those religions, acceptance of two-spirit, acceptance of someone who is gay is condemned. And during COVID, for example, when the villages went into total lockdown, they did not want to die, so they weren't allowing anyone in. I work with 164 grantees nationwide on a suicide prevention project that is 5 years, and then they can get refunded for 10 years to really develop some strategies in their communities related to mental health, related to acceptance, related to a variety of things. And I work with 32 of them, particularly in Alaska. I've had the opportunity to go out to the villages and spend time. And you're not in a city. You may not stay in a hotel when you go to the village. You may be laying down on the mail plane that goes from one village to the next that doesn't even have a seat to get into that community. But the acceptance by the elders, acceptance by the community members of another Native American coming into their community has really been tremendous. What I've learned about Western medicine is it's about symptom suppression. You come to me with a problem and I will give you something that will help you, and you need to keep coming back to me. What I've learned in working with American Indian, Alaska Native communities, it's about you come to me and we'll do things that make you better, so you don't need to continue coming to me. For example, we will look at the cultural ways that are reawakening in some of the communities in Alaska, where they're bringing back some of their ceremonies that were condemned or even outlawed. And one step at a time, one drum at a time, one dance at a time, one piece of regalia at a time, communities are reawakening that spirit of culture that has been left beside, or even told that it was wrong or it was devil worship. And they're finding that when they do reawaken these ceremonies or rituals or create new rituals, the youth in the community are feeling like they belong. I believe belonging is critical in the work that we do. If youth don't feel like they belong as part of their development, something's missing. And we know all too well that there are entities out there that will make you feel like you belong, gangs or whatever it is. So if we can work with communities and identify ways that the youth or even the elders can come together in cultural ways and feel like they belong here. One of the communities during COVID, they took the community, Scammon Bay in particular, they took them out into nature, and they spent time out there, and the youth were bringing in driftwood from the ocean, and they were drying it, and they were cutting it, and they were giving that driftwood to elders. That's one of the traditions in Alaska, is they will do subsistence, and they give away their first kill. It goes to the elders. And there was one 15-year-old boy, the look on his face when he gave elders in his community some of that wood, he said, I felt like I belonged here for the first time in my life. So we were worried about COVID and individual youth being kind of isolated, and if there wasn't acceptance in their family, but yet they were with COVID having to stay in that community or family, that there could be abuse. So we wanted to send messages out. So what we're doing in Alaska is developing digital stories of Alaska Native, Two-Spirit, or LGBTQ individuals sharing their coming out stories or their acceptance stories, so that individuals can have it on their cell phone and maybe they can listen to it in private. And it's not something that's blasted all over the community, so that they can realize they're not alone, that they're not alone. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Gary. It's, you know, when you're talking about Western medicine, it's really curious how science doesn't or rarely takes into account spirit and spiritual work. And you're kind of naming that cultural element that just, it's so elusive, you can't quite grab onto it, but it's that fingerprint that kind of allows culture to kind of exist in the community. And so when we're thinking about like that story that you just shared about that youth that got that intergenerational moment of kind of coming forth to their elder, which is maybe an experience that they had never really gotten to share with an elder. And so it's that fingerprint is so important, and it's going to be unique to every culture that you engage with, really all over the world. So I appreciate that answer. Thank you. Quentin, I'm coming back to you. As you know, you've already mentioned you are the founder and executive director of the Knights and Orchids Society, an organization that serves queer community in Alabama and across the South. What are the services your organization offers, and how are you answering the call of the community that has had no one to turn to for so long?
I don't think we've reinvented the wheel. I just think that we've learned to adapt and go with what works for us. And historically, I think what we've seen is that we keep us safe. We take care of each other. We always have. And I think what we learned was that we were in a particular position to leverage a lot of networks and relationships that we had made in previous careers, and just found a way to bring that together in navigating the resources that we need ourselves. I literally started this work by writing down the resources that I needed to acquire being a Black trans man. You know, what was the process for the name change? What was the process for the gender marker change? How can we combat housing issues? Because I've had housing issues. I've been houseless several times throughout the course of my transition, and a lot of times it's unfortunate, but a lot of our youth start to experience that houselessness after they come out, or after they've shown who they really are to the world, and unfortunately haven't been accepted in most places. So to combat those things, TKO, we're the first and only Black trans-led organization in the state that is a STD and STI clinic. So we have a wellness aspect to our programming, but because our organization is run and led by Black trans and queer folks, we also understand the day-to-day needs of trans people, whether it's connecting you to a community of other trans people across the state, across the South, but the everyday resources, housing vouchers, food and sustainability. We have our own community garden. We have our own food truck. We have our own safe space facilities where we do everything from STD and STI testing all the way over to podcasting and communications work in-house. I think probably the most important thing that we do is, being Black trans and queer folks, we understand that when we talk about health and wellness, we have managed to create a system of universal health care in virtually a resource desert. We provide wellness care in the form of our clients have access to a general practitioner, they have access to a mental health counselor, as well as an endocrinologist. And these specialist physicians that we work with, we also train. Some of them come to us with knowledge and only serve queer and trans people. And then some of them come to us with no knowledge of serving queer and trans folks, but they have a ton of knowledge of serving people in general. And those are the folks that we look to work with. So we have our own network of doctors that we work with in the state. All of our doctors can provide telehealth care. We do all of our HIV and STI testing in-house for our clients. We have a mail order pharmacy, so our clients never have to go into pharmacies and face the stares or having to be misgendered in front of a group of people. We have counseling available. We have support groups where our clients can reach out to us. We have members of our staff who are licensed social workers. We have folks on our staff who are community members who bring 10, 15 years of experience. So we try to be in one place. Understand how difficult it is to access resources and to just want to live out loud, being a Black trans person, particularly in the rural South. So we do everything we can to make sure that that process is as easy and as seamless as possible. I think the thing that I'm most proud about is we also have a youth program. We understood that, well, we understand. Our youth came to us and demanded more responsibility. And I think what I lacked as a leader growing up, what I really wanted more of was to be able to have those intergenerational conversations with the elders who had come before us to lead the work. But then also understanding that takes a level of maturity to want to hand that responsibility over, and then some grooming. But I wish I would have had more elders who looked like me, who were trans like me. Like Trudy was saying earlier, I didn't see any Black trans men in my community growing up. To my knowledge, I was one of the first here in the city who was out. And for me, that meant being visibility was also a responsibility to me. It was one in which I was willing to put myself out there so people could see that I'm just one option of what a person looks like when they have access to affirming medical care. So we design our programs to center the needs of trans people. And by centering the needs of trans people, we ensure that we reach every other issue that any other demographic of people are facing, whether it's housing insecurity, whether it's food insecurity, whether it's job insecurity. Trans folks face these services all day. And by centering on the folks who have the least resources and the less access, we ultimately have created a system where all people can thrive. People from low income neighborhoods, people of color, people from rural areas. These resources have already been created. So now we just have to continue to find ways to move resources into those areas where the community needs the most. And I think one of the best things is people get to see queer and trans folks leading the work. We've always been on the front line helping, but we always get erased from the history books. And I think this is one time with TKO where you can't deny that the people who are providing the resources are Black and queer folks.
Amazing. Yeah, there's something really remarkable in what you said about seeing your elders. I mean, how can you envision what your future will look like if you have no connection to an elder community? So that's really powerful. We're going to kind of just take a moment to there's a lot of stories and a lot of energy that we're bringing into this space. And I just kind of want to take a moment to pause so we can be as intentional as possible. And I know our interpreters are having to catch up to where we're at. So I want to take a moment to just soak in where we're at. And let me see here. Thank you so much for that answer, Quentin. Trudy, we're going to go back to you. You have made a significant impact on health equity for transgender and two-spirit people in Native communities. Tell us about your time as an expert consultant with Act Against AIDS initiative for transgender women under collaborative efforts with the Center for Disease Control and other affiliate organizations. What was that experience like?
This particular experience, I've never ever in my life have been to Brooklyn, and it was a culture shock for me because I've always heard of Brooklyn and Manhattan and all these places, New York. And in graduate school, I learned how the natives who owned that land sold that land over for a very small amount of jewelry. And to see the real estate value of that land now, it's just so alarming, but also to be in a space where being asked to participate in a HIV educational promotional video and photo shoot, and being at the table with other trans identified individuals was an experience, because never in my lifetime have I ever thought that I would see my picture, my video on the CDC, and working in public health and in HIV. I always question, like, why are why aren't there any educational materials that we disseminate to the public that reflect my community, my identity? Why is it always the cisgendered individuals that are on these pamphlets? And to be asked over by the CDC to participate was a life-changing experience, but it also made me understand of how HIV prevention education outreach has come so far. Because I remember back in high school learning about AIDS and working in the field, and then looking at how um, different educational materials were specifically focusing on specific populations and communities. And to be at the same table with trans men was was awesome, because as a trans woman, I don't know much about trans men's health, but to sit there and listen to their stories, it was so informative, because they know what it's like. And over a as a native trans woman of color, I take that back and look at the healthcare that I received through the Indian Health Service, and looking at, will my picture be in one of those Indian Health Services one day that is shared by the CDC. And to my knowledge, I have not seen any of it yet, but I'm hoping that the Indian Health Service and 638 tribal healthcare facilities that are owned by tribes do become more open-minded and inclusive to bring in materials that reflect their community and include the tradition and culture. Because I will never forget that experience gave me the opportunity to actually wear my traditional Navajo outfit and walk the streets of Brooklyn, New York. And when I share that experience, I tell other Native trans women that your voice and your presence is needed. And that's why I inspire young trans women of color over to get involved. And I always tell them, like, sometimes you may be the only person of color sitting at the table, but your voice is powerful, because you are in that space to represent your community, and only you know what it's like, because others don't. So I think that experience really opened up my eyes. And also, that same organization reached out to me when they asked me to provide lists of names of natives to do a promotional for the National Native HIV/AIDS Awareness Day. And I was very proud to refer a local Paskayaki tribal member. And when he when they flew him out to LA for a photo shoot, and when he showed me the poster, I was pretty much in tears over to see that, to see a native on a poster with the CDC that was shared through NAHAT. So with that experience, I always say that anything is possible, and that when you receive an invitation, to take that opportunity and to make your presence known, but also remember you are there on behalf of your community. Thank you.
That's incredible. Thank you so much, Trudy, for that answer. You know, I completely recognize the power in kind of taking space up and being, even if it means that you're the lone voice in that moment. But I also have to recognize how difficult and isolating and scary that is, because your passport is this body and this lived experience. It's what really allows you to kind of leverage trust with the community to get them connected to the services that they need. But that work, that bridge, the bridge making is very, very difficult. And I know it's amazing to see a Native person on the CDC poster, but it's also like, how long did it have to take for us to get here too? I think the duality and sitting on both sides is important. Because even to Quentin's point, I couldn't walk, in this day and age, if I were to walk into a doctor's office and the doctor being like, oh my God, you're Black. I've never taken care of a Black patient. That is asinine, and we would recognize that. But so many trans people, Native or not, have to walk into spaces being both patient and educator of their physicians and kind of care professionals. So I just wanted to say how much I appreciated that answer, and so appreciate your bridge making specifically. Gary, we're going to turn back to you. I know we have something incredible to celebrate, because that last month marked a year for the Spirit, Honor, and Inclusion newsletter that you helped create. So what has this newsletter, I know you've already kind of touched on it briefly, but what has this newsletter meant to you, and where do you hope, to see it grow?
Well, and it goes back to we must create a space. We must have a place where Two-Spirit, LGBTQ, trans can be at the table and help educate us about issues that are very important to them. And because I believe, a colleague of mine said one time, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And that really speaks a lot. So last year, I just felt it was important that we needed to keep Two-Spirit out in front of what was happening with the communities in Alaska and around the United States that we work with. Especially with the previous administration, they didn't want to hear about it. They had the Health Advisory Task Force, but it was totally, it wasn't even talked about. They didn't bring them together. And so I wanted to put this back on our agenda, back on our calendar and out in front. And I wanted to do it by every month having a different guest editor share their story or share what's happening in their community, and then an ally to our community share stories, and then look in different resources that we can share with others all around the nation that youth or any individual can tap into. So this is our second year of the Spirit, Honor, Inclusion magazine. And what it's led to is awareness. Now, SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration, has really gotten behind this newsletter, and they're sharing it and they're talking about it. Their colleagues and their grant officers are talking about inviting us to the table to have these conversations, not as an afterthought, but there at the very beginning, so that we are there when we're needed and we're there from the very beginning. What it has done, Sage Alaska approached me, and we are now doing a history of Two-Spirit LGBTQ in the state of Alaska. And what we're doing is identifying, there's over 100 individuals that are elders that are passing on. And we want to get those stories and share what their knowledge is of our communities in the state of Alaska. So that's another project that we're working on with Sage Alaska. And I think it's going to be wonderful to have this knowledge left in the state of Alaska, because not a lot of it has been spoken about. So don't be surprised if I don't reach out to you and ask any of you to be a guest editor for our newsletter.
I won't take any offense. I promise. I promise. That's so incredible. And also, you know, what's also powerful is the archival kind of ability of something like this. You know, this is essentially kind of like a storyteller history kind of like monument that you can look back to over the years. So that's really incredible. Thank you so much. Quentin, we're coming to you. The attitude of the work at TKO screams by us, for us, and there's so much power in that. You know, kind of similar to the passport. You know, this body is the passport into the communities that we serve. So where do you envision the work going next? And what would you need from the wider community, including funders, including housing developers, including legislators? What do you need from them to continue that work?
Oh, support, unwavering support. What we say to funders, my ask is always that if we're talking about changing the structures of how we're doing this work and building sustainable futures, then we need those sustainable investments. We need long-term funding. We need that funding to be general operating support. And the reason why that is because we're doing this work for a group of people who are non-traditional. And which, when we're doing non-traditional work, you cannot do non-traditional work with a traditional approach. So everything that we do in the South, it looks like it may look backwards to some people. It may look like it doesn't make sense to some people. But I can assure you that trans people, you cannot say that you have a wellness program for trans people, and it does not include hormone therapy. That is backwards. And what we've been doing, what we see in the state and across the South, is that we get told too often, you know, let us get regular healthcare out of the way first. Well, this is regular healthcare because I am a regular person. I regularly need to go to the doctor, and I regularly need these hormones for me to feel like I am who I am, so that you get to experience me the way that I experience me every day. That's what the hormones do for folks who are trans. And when you come to an organization that was created by queer and trans folks, you don't have to spend the 6 sessions explaining that to people, because our doctors understand that, because they're committed to treating trans folks. We know when you come through the door that there are certain things that you're going to want to talk to us about, and we are ready. We're ready to have those conversations. Not only can we empathize, we can relate, because a lot of us have been homeless. A lot of us have been hungry. A lot of us have been without jobs. And I got my first 2 evictions by making sure that not only I had somewhere to stay, that people who were houseless, who were trying to get to a better place, had somewhere to live. So we understand the lived experiences of trans people because we are trans people. And what we look forward to, our vision for TKO, is that trans people get to exist in the world as their whole authentic selves, and they can thrive, not just survive, in a place free from harm. That's what we want. We want trans people to be able to exist and live in this world that was not created for us, free from harm. That's medical harm, that's the environmental harm, that's the physical harm, the mental harm. We want to be able to show up as our authentic selves, leave our contributions in this world as well.
Amazing. Absolutely amazing. You know, I think when you mentioned how centering specific aspects of care, like HRT, for example, it's really interesting to hear, because if we've seen the pattern where we, you know, let's get this out of the way, we'll prioritize that later, and the natural, you know, design of the sense of urgency will always put that at the side. So it is designed to kind of always be an afterthought. And so I love that you're kind of just making sure that this is at the forefront and centered, and then everything else will naturally kind of move with that. So thank you so much, Quentin. Trudy, I'm going to be turning back to you. We are actually at the last round of questions, and I'm checking the time. I know we had some technical difficulties in the beginning, so I'm just letting the audience know that we won't have time for the Q&A, unfortunately, at the end, but we'll make sure to get you connected to all of these individuals and their work after the show. So all of this will be able, you'll be able to access these resources. Trudy, you have continued to be a leader for trans and two-spirit advocacy at many levels, acquiring multiple degrees, being recognized for your dedications with many awards, a presidential run for Navajo Nation, founding the the 2S LGBTQ Rainbow Gathering, and decades-long advocacy for health equity. When you look back at all of these accomplishments. What is your vision for what's next? You know, and what do you need from the wider community to accomplish those dreams?
I think, first of all, I think that what the federal government has done to us and the historical trauma that has been inflicted on us, how individuals may think like, oh, that happened long ago, get over it. But how federal Indian policies impact tribal communities. And my dream vision that I see is allowing individuals that are gender non-binary to grow up in their tribal community of acceptance of services provided for them, where they can go off to school and be supported and live in a household where their parents understand who they are, not moving off the reservation to urban cities where they may engage in risky, illegal behavior. And it would be a dream to see how trans healthcare is provided in a tribal community. I think that is something, you know, that is a long dream, but I think it can be done because within the Indian Health Services, there are different populations, different health disparities that are being addressed. And why isn't it time for the Indian Health Service to address trans health? So therefore, tribal members can stay home and get the hormones that they need instead of going to the city or going across the border to Mexico for black market hormones. So that's my dream, is to see one day where policy changes are reflected to be more inclusive. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Trudy. I can hear the plea because all of this, you know, all of this work, all of the language, all of the articles, all of the research is distilling, you know, you can distill that down to just begging people just to just see the humanity in individuals that happen to identify as a transgender or gender nonconforming or native or black. And so, you know, I hear that plea, and, you know, I'm right there next to you on my knees, begging and hoping that we see a future that mirrors what you just described. So thank you so much. Gary, I'm going to be turning to you. In addition to providing technical assistance through intensive training to local tribal communities, you have reclaimed and harnessed the power of storytelling through the elders that you serve. What was the radical act of story? What has the radical act of storytelling taught you?
To be inclusive, to realize that everyone has a story, everyone has a story to tell. And I believe that my ancestors used to teach by telling a story. They would have very few words, and there would be a lesson, a mini teach in that story, and we're capturing a lot of those mini teaches before the elders pass on. And the youth immediately listen. We also are realizing that as American Indian and Alaska Native individuals, it's about coming home. We may go to an urban setting part of our life, and Trudy shared that that could be dangerous for individuals because of what's out there. But when we look at our hearts are about our land, or about our home, or about where we belong. So if we look at individuals coming back to our communities that are trans, that are two-spirit, and they run for office, and they get on the council or they get on the advisory boards, that these individuals are going to be able to make a difference for our grandchildren and great-grandchildren 7 generations down. So for me, the story is the important piece. It isn't all of the other words that go with it. It's the simple mini teach and the lesson that someone's going to walk away with. And I also believe that if you look at 10 children, and the oldest one is 30 and the youngest one is 2, the 2-year-old is going to look at the 4-year-old as their elder. The 4-year-old is going to look at the 6-year-old as their elder, and so on and so on. So that it's about inclusion, it's about belonging, and it's about coming home.
What a beautiful kind of description of what elder can be. And that's why it's so interesting that it's kind of subjective. And I think about that a lot. For example, in the trans community, what an elder looks like is different, in trans community. So that is really powerful. And I remember during our initial conversation, storytelling, just like you had mentioned, an act of teaching that your ancestors used to partake in. It's again returning back to the people that we should be, whatever was robbed because of colonization. It's just a really powerful tool to be able to use. Quentin, I have the last question for you. And, I stumbled upon this randomly. You did not mention this during our conversation, but you've made a significant impact through a never-ending list of accomplishments, but including making the Time 100 in 2022. So what vision do you have for TKO, but also specifically for yourself in the future?
No, I did not mention that. For me, it's just never been about the awards. It's always been about the ability to do the work. That's literally why I get into it. I get to be a part of the community, and I get to help people find themselves and just transition from surviving to thriving. And it's just, that is the blessing for me. So my vision for TKO remains that TKO becomes a sustainable homestead, metaphorically, physically, in all the ways that it can exist. I once had a person who's close to me tell me that TKO could be the Salvation Army, but for queer folks. And I think that's a vision that I've been striving for. I want people to be able to have access to an organization like TKO everywhere. Understanding that when we're talking about the number of trans folks who openly identify as trans, and where they reside, geographically, more of us reside in the South than anywhere else. But we don't have the resources in the South that would make you believe that. The media would paint you a story to make you believe that most of us reside in places that are more affirming, like California and DC and New York. But actually, geographically, more of us are located in the South. And for me, the vision is to be a resource and a safe haven for those of us in the South who can't leave, who don't want to leave. For those of us where the South is home and has been home, we want to be able to access those resources, like Trudy said, and like Gary was saying, at home. We want to be able to go back home or not have to leave home to be able to live and be who we are. So we will continue to work to ensure that people in the places that are been often forgotten or looked over, under-resourced, like the rural areas, the country communities, making sure that those folks know that you don't have to leave if you don't want to. Because we're working every day to make sure that the South is safer for you, that the South is a place where you can exist. And where people often believe that the South is behind time, we're actually leading this movement to create a new healthcare system, a new wellness system that benefits us. So where people believe that because we don't have the resources, we do have the resources. We have the manpower and we have more passion than anywhere else. And geographically, we have more people to make it possible. So we will continue to fight to make sure that nobody has to leave their home to be able to live whole.
Period. Thank you so much, Quentin. And really this, this very new budding relationship, I hope we continue. And with all of, these speakers, this has been an incredible conversation. And it's so important to think about the individual kind of impact that each of us have to offer. Gary had just mentioned in a private chat that any one of us can be that role model. And it's just time that we step up and advocate for our communities, define what that community looks like for us. When we look towards housing and healthcare, all of these are designed to be interwoven, because that's really what the key is when we think about home. So thank you to these speakers. I'm so grateful and honored to, just been able to foster this conversation. Thank you, thank you, thank you.